of 5 webinars on pavement sustainability. My name is Kurt Smith, and along with Tom Van Dam, we'll be serving as the hosts and moderators for these series of webinar events. We appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today and look forward to what we think will be a highly informative session. This webinar series is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration and focuses on the contents contained in the recently released FHWA publication Towards Sustainable Pavement Systems, a reference document. That document is available and can be downloaded from the FHWA website at the link shown here. Over the next 5 months, we will be presenting 5 webinars that covers various key aspects of that reference document. And each of these 5 webinars will be recorded for later posting on the FHWA website. We are currently planning for the formal presentation part of the webinar to go for about 1 hour and 40 minutes in order to allow 20 minutes for questions at the end of the webinar. Please submit your questions using the chat box feature, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. When submitting your questions, be sure to access the drop-down feature in the chat box and select the Send Questions to Staff item as shown in the graphic on the screen. We'd also like everyone to note that we will be providing 2 hours of professional development hours in the form of PD8 certificates that will be distributed for each registered attendee. But we do want to point out that these are different than continuing education units. You will want to check with your local professional licensure organization for applicability of PD8 credit for your specific situation. With that, we're ready to begin our webinar, which today is on Introduction, Concepts, and Assessment of Sustainability as it relates to pavement structures. Today's speakers include Gina Ahlstrom with the Federal Highway Administration, Steve Mensch with the University of Washington, Joop Meyer with the Wright Environment Incorporated, and Alyssa Kendall with the University of California, Davis. Again, my name is Kurt Smith, and along with Tom Van Dam, we will be moderating this webinar. At this time, then, I would like to turn it over to Gina to give us some background and overview on the FHWA's program.
Okay. So, the U.S. DOT is committed to advancing sustainability. Secretary Anthony Fox signed a policy statement in 2014, and through this policy statement, we're really encouraged to consider sustainability in all of our program areas. In 2010, Federal Highway established the Sustainable Pavements program, and the program goals are to support the UST overall goals for sustainability, increase the body of knowledge regarding sustainability of asphalt and concrete materials throughout the pavement life cycle, and increase the use of sustainable technologies and practices in pavement design, construction, preservation, and maintenance. The first order of business under this program was to develop guidance on framing the topic of sustainability for practitioners involved with pavements and materials. The document Towards Sustainable Pavements, a reference document, provides guidelines for the design, construction, preservation, and maintenance of sustainable pavements using both asphalt and concrete materials. It educates practitioners on how sustainability concepts can be incorporated into pavements and encourages the adoption of sustainable practices. The development of this document has been a collaborative effort. It contains a comprehensive review of current literature, and it went through an extensive review process by representatives from our key stakeholder groups, which included state departments of transportation and other public agencies, asphalt and concrete industries, and academia. Rest assured that this is a comprehensive document that benchmarks pavement sustainability today and helps us look to improving and moving that benchmark in the future.
Thank you, Gina. We appreciate that background. And with that information, we're now ready to start getting into exactly some of the aspects of sustainability, starting with what is sustainability, what does it mean in the pavement realm, and to cover some of these different aspects, we're going to turn now to Steve Mensch. Steve?
Thank you, Kurt. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, if you're following along in the big document, the first couple introductory chapters, which kind of set the stage for basically all the rest of the webinars here, and then I'm going to leap ahead to Chapter 10, which is basically at the end of the document, which starts to talk about different types of assessment methods. So to start out, sustainability is a word that means many things to many people. It's probably been overused to date, but so it's good to start with what it means here in this particular document. So in general, the sustainability of a human-devised system refers to its ability to, 1, exist and function within a larger system without degrading it, and 2, provide for and meet the human needs for which the system was developed. And so if you interpret that for pavements, this is where this document goes with this. Sustainability in the context of pavements refers to system characteristics that encompass a pavement's ability to achieve the engineering goals for which it was constructed, preserve and restore surrounding ecosystems, use financial, human, and environmental resources economically, and meet basic human needs such as health, safety, equity, employment, comfort, and happiness. So that's a tall order, and I would say right now we certainly don't do all of those 100%, but so I would consider that our long-term aspirational goal. So where we are now is we're really talking about, when we say sustainable or sustainable pavements, we're really talking about being more sustainable than we were. We're going for doing less bad, but keep in mind that the ultimate goal is to actually do good. So if you're looking at this slide here, it represents sort of a continuum from bad to good, pretty basic, and there's a break-even point somewhere in the middle. So on the bad side, this is typically what happens with human and infrastructure systems, is we tend to use more than we replace from the earth. Nature typically can't handle or process everything that we produce. Pollution is one way we refer to those excesses. Excesses or waste that we produce from our efforts are generally harmful to nature and society in general, and we tend to alter the ecosystems within which we exist. Now, the good side of this continuum would be we replace everything we use. Nature can handle or break down everything that we produce. The excess or waste that we produce might be beneficial. I'll get back to that in a second. And that we're more fully integrated into nature and don't tend to drastically alter the ecosystems within which we exist. So, here we are as humans now-ish, and we're basically moving over to the right in that direction. That's the idea of doing less bad than before. And that's a good start, but probably not where we ultimately want to end up being. It may seem a little bit far-fetched to get over to the right-hand side where we do actually do good, but I'll give you a couple of examples where that might be the case. So the first one, ants. So ants, you may or may not know, the biomass of ants on the face of this earth is actually greater than the biomass of humans. So if you weighed all the ants on the earth and you weighed all the humans, the ants would win. Yet we're not talking about ants being major contributors to global climate change, nature degradation, and things like that. So ants, in their existence, are more fully integrated into nature as part of the ecosystem. So they aerate soils, they process dead and decaying matter, they can be used for medicines and things like that. So there's all sorts of beneficial aspects of ants. So it is possible, actually, and many animals do show that to be more fully integrated into nature, and I would say that's on the good side. And then one more example, cherry trees. And this is really to get at the idea that sustainability is not just efficiency. Oftentimes sustainability can be equated with efficiency. In other words, sometimes the common term is eco-efficiency, basically doing more with less, but still producing harmful effects. So cherry trees, you could argue, are really inefficient, right? When they bloom in the spring, they have thousands and thousands of flowers on the tree, and each one has the capability to ultimately be another cherry tree, yet almost none of them ever are. So you could argue that a cherry tree is incredibly inefficient, yet it's fully integrated into nature, right? Its waste falls to the ground, it becomes part of the earth, and it nourishes the plants and animals around it. So the idea that we can do that with humans and human infrastructure systems may seem far-fetched, but I think we can get there, and there are examples in nature to show that it's possible. All right, so if that's sustainability in the big picture of things, how does it typically fit within an organization? Well, having looked at a lot of organizational efforts to incorporate sustainability or maybe emphasize it more, if you go back to the definition that we use for this particular guidebook, you probably come to the conclusion that sustainability really just means consider everything when you undertake a project. And everything is kind of a lot of stuff. So it really is the highest order consideration when you're looking at a project or a pavement. And it's not an add-on feature for a project. You can't get a project with a side of sustainability. It doesn't work well that way. So when organizations look at sustainability and think about how they're going to incorporate it into what they do, they typically have to set priorities within sustainability because it means basically considering everything. And you can't really do everything. So organizations sort of set priorities as to which sustainability components they particularly value, and they determine the order of precedence for these values, and they come up with a plan to operationalize those values and precedents. So really, if you look at organizations that have gone back and really tried to incorporate sustainability in a better way, I think what you find is most of them come to the conclusion that they want to step back and maybe consider the bigger systems picture, perhaps beyond things they directly control. And oftentimes they come to the conclusion that they want to raise the emphasis on human needs or the environment. And oftentimes those two ideas, especially the second one, sort of get interpreted as that's all sustainability is. But I think it's something a little bit more. Let's see. So pavement sustainability in context. So there's a lot of ways to think about pavement sustainability and how it fits into the big picture, but maybe using greenhouse gas emissions as one proxy gives a little bit of a picture. So the graph you see here shows global CO2 emissions from fuel consumption, U.S. CO2 emissions from fuel consumption, or fuel combustion, and you can actually see the percentage that's attributable to transportation. And these circles are actually drawn to scale for area. And then a really gross, rough estimate of what the materials, transport, and construction associated with pavements might generate. And in fact, that's probably a high-end estimate based on the way it was done. Note that that doesn't include the use phase, which you'll hear about later in different webinars. So that's kind of a general idea, but you've also got to remember that sustainability goes beyond greenhouse gas emissions, which are a convenient way to quantify things, but there are also many other ways to quantify sustainability and many other impacts that pavement systems have. For instance, energy consumption, habitat loss, fragmentation, or at least just change, water quality, hydrologic cycle changes, air quality, mobility access, freight mobility and access, community development, depletion of non-renewable resources, economic development. So a lot of different ways you can talk about sustainability when referring to infrastructure and, in this case, pavement systems. So this document that we're talking about here today, and for the 5 webinars that we're doing, discusses pavement sustainability and organizes it by life cycle phase. So what you're looking at here basically is an outline of the 11 major chapters, and I've highlighted chapters 3 through 8, which basically go through pavement sustainability according to these key life cycle phases: materials, pavement design, construction, use, maintenance and preservation, and end of life. And you'll hear more about those particular life cycle phases when you and Alyssa are talking about life cycle assessment later on in this webinar. And so if you look at all these things, and sustainability means consider everything, and we talked about how you may not be able to do that and you need to set priorities, I think one of the conclusions you can come to is you can't have everything. So sustainability involves trade-offs. You can't do everything. It's a broad system characteristic. So most things that you do with that system, you could argue in some manner or another could be considered sustainable. So you can't do everything though. So you need to evaluate what you can do and the trade-offs that are involved. And so in evaluating those trade-offs, you can weigh the benefits and costs of a particular feature. Oftentimes it's useful to go beyond economic analysis just because a lot of the impacts, the sustainability impacts that we talked about previously are very difficult to quantify economically. So economic impacts alone may not actually adequately capture those sustainability impacts. And also consider opportunity costs, so the cost basically of choosing one option and not choosing the other. And when weighing the benefits and costs, you really need to consider the priorities and values of the organization with which you're involved, right? There are priorities set, and those priorities are necessarily at front and center when you make decisions. And there's a certain amount of risk involved in benefits and costs. It would be great if everything was certain to happen in a particular way, but I think we all know better than that. So considering those risks are very important. Measuring sustainability is possible, and it can actually prove useful. So why would you want to measure sustainability? Well, there are a number of reasons to measure sustainability. Sort of broadly speaking in categories, you can measure it for accounting reasons, right? Provide a number or numbers for reporting requirements. So an example is, you might be asked in the future, what greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to DOT infrastructure projects in this year or next year or whatever the case may be. So you're measuring it because you need to report a number. Maybe on a higher level, you're using it for decision support, so it can provide measurements, can provide information that could influence a decision you make. So for instance, which alternative on this particular project uses the least energy? And then maybe at the highest level, you're using it for process improvement, to provide feedback to improve a process. For example, how can we reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of this particular material? Not necessarily a comparison of one alternative versus the other, but just improving one particular process. And there are several ways to measure pavement sustainability. So first, and I won't go to this one in any great detail, I'll just cover briefly here, there's performance assessment. We're all familiar with that. That is typical, traditional, and long-standing, and it uses metrics and things that we're all fairly familiar with. So you evaluate performance versus intended function. Metrics you might use are things like pavement distress, thickness, material attributes, the kinds of things that you typically may measure in pavements. I'll say that when you are comparing or looking at maybe a new system as opposed to maybe a more traditional way of doing things, usually what tends to happen is that new system is compared to the traditional ones. So for instance, if you're going to propose a porous pavement for a place that's never had it, you might consider measuring the life of that porous pavement versus the expected life of a more traditional pavement. However, you also need to consider the added benefits as well, right? Okay, so that's the typical one, and then the three that we'll concentrate on here, and I'll talk about the first two, and then I'll turn it over to talk to Alyssa and Joop to talk about life cycle assessment in a little bit more detail. Our life cycle cost analysis, sustainability rating systems, and life cycle assessment. So, life cycle cost analysis. It's a generally accepted accounting practice that uses economic analysis to evaluate the total cost of an investment option over an analysis period. And the underlying assumption, too, in life cycle cost analysis is the benefits between alternatives are the same, so you don't really need to calculate them. And that may not always be the case, especially when you're considering some of these alternative systems that maybe emphasize some sustainability characteristics. This isn't in the guidebook, but this is meant to give some background, some general trends. There have been several reports. The one I'm showing here is quite a good one to show an overview that most DOTs use life cycle cost analysis in some form.